What if I told you the biggest red flags in a man don't show up as actions first, they show up as sentences? And if you don't catch them early, you don't just lose peace, you slowly lose yourself. Because there are certain things a man can say that don't just reveal his mindset, they reveal the kind of emotional future you're walking into. And once you hear them, you don't negotiate, you notice and you decide. Have you ever ignored something he said, only to realize later it was exactly what he meant all along? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll recognize the 5 phrases that quietly end emotional safety before the relationship even breaks. There are phrases that at first glance may seem harmless, even gentle or caring, but underneath those words can hide manipulative intentions, emotional irresponsibility, and a strong resistance to self-growth. When a woman overlooks these early signals, she can slowly find herself in relationships that drain her energy, blur her clarity, and weaken her connection to her inner strength. Carl Jung, the well-known Swiss psychologist, spoke about the shadow unconscious, a hidden part of the mind where we push away traits we refuse to accept in ourselves and then unknowingly project them onto others. Thoughtful, in relationships, this is often where unhealthy patterns begin. That is why noticing these words early becomes so important, not for avoiding simple disagreement, but for preventing deeper emotional harm. Seneca once said, "It is not that life is short, but that we waste much of it, often on people who do not value it." That idea reminds us to be careful where we invest our emotional time and attention, because once it is gone, we cannot get it back in the same way. This is why each phrase you will hear carries more weight than it first appears. Ignoring them can slowly pull you into a relationship where your focus fades, your confidence weakens, and your sense of self starts to disappear. No woman who has worked on her peace, discipline, and emotional awareness should ignore patterns that repeatedly take her away from herself. Thoughtful, it is not about being suspicious of everyone, but about being conscious of behavior that repeats itself under different excuses. The danger is not always in loud arguments or obvious conflict. Often, it is in calm conversations where responsibility is quietly avoided and emotional games begin without clear warning. That is why staying alert matters. Because what looks normal on the surface can sometimes be a structure that slowly shifts power away from you without you realizing it until much later. One of the most common phrases that carries this hidden weight is when a man says, "You have to accept me as I am." At first, it may sound like honesty or even emotional vulnerability. It can appear as if he is simply being real about himself without pretending, but the deeper issue begins when this phrase is used as a shield against growth or responsibility. Thoughtful Carl Jung emphasized that self-awareness is the beginning of wisdom, but he also made it clear that real growth starts when a person stops defending their limitations and starts working on them. When someone uses "that is just how I am" to avoid change, it often shows resistance to self-improvement rather than true authenticity. This phrase usually appears after you have already noticed behaviors that feel uncomfortable, such as emotional inconsistency, lack of accountability, or subtle manipulation. Instead of acknowledging it, he may redirect the conversation or make you feel like the problem is your expectations. In some cases, he may even act as if your concern is an attack on his identity. But real authenticity is not about staying the same forever. It is about being honest enough to recognize flaws and strong enough to change them. As Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, suggested, a meaningful life is one where we act with discipline, honesty, and continuous self-correction rather than repeating the same patterns without reflection. Thoughtful, a conscious woman who values her emotional well-being should not carry the responsibility of changing someone who refuses to grow. A relationship should not feel like a one-sided effort where you are constantly adjusting, explaining, and compromising while the other person remains unchanged. That kind of imbalance slowly builds frustration and emotional exhaustion. Over time, you may find yourself making excuses for behavior you once questioned simply to keep peace. But peace built on self-abandonment is not real peace. It is silence at the cost of your own needs. Accepting someone does not mean accepting everything without question. There is a difference between love and tolerance of unhealthy patterns. When a man refuses to reflect on his behavior, it is not your job to carry that emotional responsibility for him. Growth is a personal choice, not something that can be forced by patience alone. Stoic philosophy also reminds us that the people around us influence our direction in life. If someone close to you is not moving forward, it becomes much harder for you to stay aligned with your own progress. Relationships should support expansion, not limitation. So when you hear this phrase, it is important to look beyond its surface meaning. Ask yourself whether he is genuinely open to growth or simply protecting himself from accountability. Because if the pattern shows constant resistance, defensiveness, and avoidance of self-reflection, then the issue is not misunderstanding, it is a mindset that will repeat itself in different situations.
And over time, that repetition becomes the foundation of emotional frustration, where you begin to feel like you are carrying the relationship alone without real partnership or balance. Another phrase that often appears in early conversations is, "All my exes were crazy or toxic." At first, it may sound like casual venting or a way of sharing past hurt. It might even create a sense of sympathy. But underneath this statement can be a pattern of blame, emotional immaturity, and lack of self-reflection. Stoic philosophy teaches that real strength comes from examining our own role in every situation, rather than placing all responsibility outside ourselves. Epictetus emphasized that it is not events that disturb us, but how we interpret them. If someone consistently presents themselves as the only stable person in all their past relationships, while every partner is labeled as the problem, it raises an important question about self-awareness.
From a psychological perspective, Carl Jung explained that what we do not acknowledge within ourselves often gets projected outward. This means that unresolved emotional patterns can lead a person to repeat similar conflicts in different relationships while believing the fault always lies elsewhere. Thoughtful. When a man describes all his past relationships in extreme negative terms, it can indicate that he has not fully processed his own behavior within those experiences. Instead of reflection, there is simplification. Instead of accountability, there is blame. This creates a dangerous mindset because it places him in a permanent position of innocence and others in a permanent position of fault. A conscious woman should pay attention to whether he ever mentions what he could have done differently in past relationships, or whether his entire story is focused only on what others did to him. If responsibility is always one-sided in his narrative, then the pattern is likely to continue in future relationships as well. The risk here is simple but serious. A person who does not take responsibility in past relationships rarely changes in new ones without conscious effort. Instead, the pattern continues, only with a different person playing the next role. Over time, you may realize that the same complaints he had about others begin to shift toward you as well, because the root issue was never addressed. And then there is another phrase that can sound loving on the surface but carries emotional pressure underneath. "If you really loved me, you would do what I ask." This statement may appear like an expression of emotional need, but in reality, it introduces control into the space of love. It turns affection into a condition where your love is measured by compliance. This is where emotional boundaries become extremely important. Stoic philosophy strongly emphasizes that real love cannot be forced or demanded. It must exist freely, without manipulation or fear. When love becomes tied to obedience, it loses its foundation of respect. Epictetus taught that no one can control your inner state unless you allow them to. And this phrase attempts exactly that, to connect your feelings of love with your willingness to obey requests, even when they go against your comfort or values. From a psychological perspective, Carl Jung would describe this as an imbalance of emotional power. When insecurity or fear of loss is present, it can lead a person to use emotional language that indirectly pressures the other person into compliance. Instead of open communication, there is subtle conditioning. Instead of mutual respect, there is expectation shaped through guilt. When someone says this to you, the underlying message is not love, but control disguised as affection. It suggests that your feelings are valid only when they align with their demands. Over time, this can make you question your own boundaries, your own decisions, and even your own emotional instincts. And that is where emotional imbalance begins to form quietly but steadily, often without immediate realization. An emotionally mature woman must have the clarity to distinguish between a healthy request and a demand that is disguised as care or love. At first, giving in to such phrases may feel like affection, understanding, or even emotional harmony, but over time, something slowly changes inside. You begin to lose pieces of yourself without noticing it immediately. Your authenticity, your boundaries, your personal power, and your inner stability. What starts as a small compromise can quietly grow into a pattern where your needs are constantly placed second. Concerned. The most dangerous part is that the more you adjust, the more expectations tend to expand. It begins as a simple proof of love, then becomes a repeated expectation, and later turns into emotional pressure that feels normal even when it is not. Eventually, you may no longer clearly recognize whether your actions come from genuine love or from fear of losing the relationship itself. These types of phrases do not build strong emotional foundations, instead they slowly weaken them from within. That is why it is so important to pause when you find yourself in situations where guilt is being used as a tool. If you are made to feel wrong for having boundaries, for protecting your time, or for expressing a different opinion, then you are likely facing someone who confuses love with control or possession. Real connection does not require you to erase yourself. It allows you to exist fully, with your thoughts, your emotions, and your individuality intact. You are not meant to shrink yourself in order to be accepted. You are meant to be in a relationship where mutual respect allows both people to grow without fear or pressure. When a man says, "If you really loved me, you would do what I ask," the surface may sound emotional, but the deeper meaning is very different. It is not a request for understanding. It is a challenge directed at your identity and your sense of loyalty. This is where emotional manipulation often hides behind the language of love. Carl Jung explained that true love is not based on control or possession, but on awareness and freedom within connection. Stoic philosophy also supports this idea by teaching that real relationships are built on mutual respect, not emotional submission or guilt-driven decisions. When love is used as a condition for obedience, it stops being love and becomes influence disguised as care. Allowing this pattern to continue can gradually affect your emotional discipline and your self-esteem. Each time you act against your own comfort just to avoid conflict, you slowly disconnect from your inner truth. A woman who has worked on herself, who understands her value, and who respects her emotional balance should not betray her own clarity just to maintain temporary peace. Because every time you ignore your inner voice to satisfy external pressure, you drift further away from your authentic self. And once this pattern is repeated enough times, it stops feeling unusual and starts feeling normal, which is where emotional imbalance quietly settles in. The most important thing to understand is that manipulation rarely begins with something extreme. It often starts small, almost invisible. One request, then another, then expectations that gradually increase until you find yourself adjusting more than you realize. In such dynamics, you slowly stop acting from your own will and start reacting to someone else's emotional direction. That is why emotional awareness is not just helpful, it is necessary. You are not here to constantly prove your worth or earn love through compliance. You are here to experience a relationship where respect is natural, not conditional. A healthy response in such situations is not emotional reaction, but grounded awareness. Standing firm in your boundaries does not mean you lack love or empathy. It means you understand yourself well enough not to abandon your values for approval. When someone respects you, they do not need emotional pressure to keep you close. They communicate openly, even in disagreement, without forcing compliance or using guilt as a tool. Thoughtful, that difference alone separates emotional maturity from emotional control. Another phrase that carries a deeper psychological weight is when someone says, "You're not enough for me." At first, it may feel like criticism, rejection, or even motivation to improve. But beneath the surface, it often becomes a direct challenge to your self-worth. It is not always about truth. It is often about projection. Carl Jung explained that people frequently project their internal dissatisfaction onto others, turning their own emotional struggles into external judgment. In such cases, the statement is less about you and more about their inner state. Stoic philosophy reminds us that our value is not determined by external opinions, but by our actions, character, and inner alignment. Marcus Aurelius emphasized that we should not allow another person's perspective to control our inner world. When someone repeatedly makes you feel insufficient, the intention is often not growth, but control through insecurity. It creates a dynamic where you begin to chase approval, constantly trying to meet shifting expectations that never truly stabilize. Today it is one standard, tomorrow another, and the cycle never truly ends. Over time, this can create emotional exhaustion. You begin questioning yourself more than necessary, doubting qualities you once accepted confidently. That is why emotional clarity is essential. A conscious woman does not measure her worth through unstable external validation. She understands that her value is not something to be negotiated or proven repeatedly. Instead, it is something to be recognized and respected within any healthy connection. The deeper danger of such statements is not the words themselves, but the psychological effect they create when repeated. They can slowly shift your internal focus from self-trust to self-doubt. Instead of feeling secure in who you are, you start trying to become acceptable in someone else's changing perception. That is where emotional imbalance develops quietly, without dramatic signs, but with long-term consequences. In the end, all of these phrases point to one simple truth. Words can carry hidden patterns, and not every emotional statement is as innocent as it sounds. When you start to recognize these patterns early, you protect yourself from confusion, emotional pressure, and slow loss of self-respect. Awareness is not about fear or suspicion. It is about clarity. It helps you see when communication is healthy and when it is being used to influence your emotions in a way that removes your choice instead of respecting it. A strong and emotionally mature woman does not lose herself in the process of loving someone. She listens, she cares, but she also stays grounded in her values, her boundaries, and her inner peace. Real connection never asks you to abandon yourself or feel small to be accepted. It allows honesty, respect, and mutual understanding to exist together without control or guilt. And when something repeatedly disturbs your peace instead of protecting it, the most powerful response is not emotional reaction, but calm awareness and wise distance.